Good afternoon, all. Today we'll be covering the next part of Chapter 1. We're going to cover the different fields of psychology. Now, last time we went over the history of psychology and how some of those perspectives came around. Today we're talking about the current fields of psychology that are around today. And so we're going to introduce a few new perspectives and then talk about what's happening in the field now. So the first perspective we're going to get into that's a lot more modern than the previous perspectives we talked about is the cognitive perspective. So the cognitive perspective, it says that it examines the nature of the mind and how mental processes influence behavior. So this is really one of the main perspectives that's used today. It's very prevalent. It's kind of one of the more accepted ones. So this is really a strong perspective that I'd say you'll want to remember. It definitely has ties from both structuralism and functionalism. So instead of just choosing one or the other, this perspective kind of combined the two. So this says that humans are information processors that are governed by thought. So pretty much we have a bunch of different information coming in to us at all times, whether that's, information from what we hear, what we see, what we feel. And then we kind of have to use our minds to process what does that mean. Should I care about this? Should I not? How do I respond? So that's really what the cognitive perspective is thinking about. And so we also talk about Gestalt psychology. So there's this old white dude, Gestalt. You don't really need to know about him, just know that he's connected to cognitive. And he had this thing called Gestalt psychology, which is kind of a subsection of this cognitive perspective. And specifically, Gestalt psychology looked at how the mind organizes the elements of an experience to create a whole. So in other words, how you take information from what you see and what you hear and put it together into one whole image. So if you hear someone, you see someone, you can put it together and say, oh, that's my mom, that kind of thing, So it's really combining all experiences into one unified image. The cognitive perspective is pretty new in terms of psychology. It really came around in the 60s and 70s is when it's really started. But like I said, it's still around today. But we do call this time the cognitive revolution because we like to be dramatic. So this was really the time where the cognitive perspective really hit off, where it got that peak of interest. And one of the main things it really focused on was language learning. So how do humans learn language, and why do some animals, why are they not able to? But then they also would look at teaching primates sign language, that kind of thing, or how do parrots learn to speak? So that was something that they were really interested in, and how does that come around? So, again, the cognitive revolution, the cognitive perspective says that the mind is a system that processes, stores, and retrieves information. So if you want to think of the cognitive perspective as a computer, that's a really good analogy. Because a computer, we do things on it, it stores everything we're doing, and we can always bring back old files that we need to look at again because we forgot something. So the cognitive perspective now, it's actually split again into two different fields of study that we focus on. So we have cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience. So they're very similar, they're very related, but cognitive psychology focuses more on the mental processes. So how does the mind understand something? And then cognitive neuroscience is focusing more on what's happening in the brain during these mental processes. And so they do this with electrical recordings or brain imaging techniques. All of this we're going to cover later in this term of how you can study the brain, as well as how can you study mental processes. So a lot of the experimental techniques we're going to talk about was really derived from trying to understand this cognitive perspective. Now, moving on from the cognitive perspective, we have the social-cultural perspective. So this is another really popular perspective nowadays, and this is trying to understand how everything going on around an individual influences that individual's behavior. So in other words, how does someone's friends, family, work environment, or even what country they're from, or what area of the country they're from, how does that affect the person what the person is, or who that person is? So how does, growing up in North America, how does that influence our behavior, thoughts, and feelings versus someone that grew up in, say, Asia, or someone that grew up in Europe or Africa? So that's what the social cultural perspective really focuses on. So there are a lot of, obviously with social cultural, that's social and then cultural. So first we're going to focus on just the social components. So social psychology, again, is a big field nowadays, and this studies the presence of other people's influences on our behavior. So another person's influence could be their physical presence, whether they're around us or not. It could be an implied presence. So, like, if that someone's going to come around kind of thing, and then imagined presence. So that's kind of how, like, your thought of, like, oh, what would my mom think of this? That kind of thing. So that's an imagined presence rather than a physical presence, would be your mom standing over your shoulder, right? So there's little differences between physical, implied, and imagined, but overall, it's really just whether the person's there, the person's gonna be there, or the person isn't there at all, but you still care about their thoughts. So this social perspective, it does overlap with the behavioral perspective, as well as the cognitive perspective and the biological perspective, because you're observing behavior, so that's the behaviorist, the cognitive perspective. So again, it's the combining the multiple different information coming in, so that's both the physical and implied presence and imagined presence. When you combine all those, then again, that's kind of like what the cognitive perspective does. And then also the biological perspective, so what's happening biologically, how does where you're from, or genetics kind of thing, how does that affect things? So really, these perspectives that we're using today really combine all of those previous perspectives we talked about. So now we're going to look at the cultural perspective of the social cultural perspective. And again, you want to kind of learn some of these terms. So what is culture? So culture is the values, beliefs, behaviors, traditions that are shared and passed on. So culture can be within a family, it can be within an ethnic group, it can be within a national group, that kind of thing. So there's small culture and big culture. Then we also will talk about norms. So norms are just, it's a short word for what's the normal behavior of a group. And usually these behaviors, these norms, are unwritten. These aren't something that you learn by reading a book. It's something you learn by experience. And so that's what cultural psychology is. It kind of studies how someone's culture and how the norms of the culture really influence a person's behavior their thoughts, their feelings. So this definition I have here is just cultural psychology examines transmission of culture, psychological similarities and differences among people from diverse cultures. So cultural psychology also looks at what happens when people from different cultures interact. How does that affect how they interact with each other? How do these differences affect people? And the next one we're going to talk about, this is going to be the last perspective we talk about, is the biological perspective. This one's a little, straightforward. It's looking at how does biology play a role in psychology. So it's really focusing on the brain. Most of it's on the brain, but we do also look at other bodily functions that regulate behavior. So those could be hunger, that could be fear. How does fear react? Which fear, could be a thought, but fear, you can usually physically see it. Someone will physically respond to fear. So how does that happen? Why does that happen? And that's what the biological perspective is trying to figure out. Now, today, then one of the fields we talk about is behavioral neuroscience, or some people call it physiological psychology. And again, that's studying the interaction between the brain and the body. How do they work together to change how we behave? How do they work together to affect how we think and feel? Within that, we also have behavior genetics. So this is trying to understand what factor genetics has in our behavioral tendencies. So does genetics play a role in whether we're an outgoing person? Does genetics play a role in whether or not you'll have certain mental problems like anxiety or depression? Or is there a genetic factor to that or not? So again, we'll really be getting into that in chapters 3 and a bit in chapter 4 as well. So you can look forward to that. And then we've got evolutionary psychology. And so this is connected to the genetics factor, because as we'll learn, or as you may have learned in a biology course, evolution is kind of the passing of genetics from one to another, and then also how things change, how genetics change. So evolutionary psychology is kind of playing on how has human behavior changed over time? What effect does evolution have on how humans behave, how we think? So this could be, is there an evolutionary reason why when you feel scared, you get goosebumps on your skin? Is there an evolutionary reason why, our heart beats faster when we're excited? That kind of thing. So it's trying to understand how evolution changed the human behavior. And then we've got sociobiology. So sociobiology is combining the social perspective with the biological perspective. So that's complex social behaviors that are also built into the human species as a product of our evolution. So this is looking at how the social interactions from hundreds to thousands of years ago, evolution has had an effect on those social behaviors. And so how has evolution and social behaviors interacted over time? So obviously natural selection, which we'll again talk about, which is really just the survival of the fittest. So how has natural selection favored certain behaviors versus other behaviors over time? Now, we've talked about a lot of different perspectives in psychology, and so those are, by perspectives, those are really different ways of viewing psychology, of studying psychology to try to understand what's happening in the brain. Today, then, psychology is a very big field, and there's a lot of different fields of psychology. So while we're going to be focusing on different perspectives in this course, we'll also be talking about different fields of psychology. And so here's a nice list of different fields of psychology. So we've got clinical psychology, which is what everyone kind of thinks of. So that's, the stereotypical someone laying on a couch saying, with a therapist asking, how does that make you feel? Obviously, there's a lot more to that. That's not what clinical psychology is really all about. That is an aspect, but that's not all of it. Then we have cognitive psychology. So again, that's really focusing on that cognitive perspective. We have biopsychology, or neuropsychology is the more common name for that. That's a really big emerging field right now. That's what I would say is the largest growing field of psychology. Then we have developmental psychology. So how does our experiences when we're young influence who we are as adults? How does what we do in our, when we're young adults affect when we're older adults? That kind of thing. We've got experimental psychology. So that's really focusing on doing experiments, influencing, manipulating, that kind of thing. And we'll spend a lot of time on that. And then we've got industrial organizational psychology. And that's looking at the psychology of the workplace kind of thing, or team building. So really focusing on how to optimize what's going on in a team environment. How does the structure of different organizations or workplaces affect behavior, affect morale, that kind of thing. We're not going to focus too much on that in this class. That's definitely more of a Psych 105 type of class, along with developmental, personality, and social. Personality psychology, pretty straightforward, focuses on what makes a person's personality, what influences affect that. And then social psychology, again, is really that social cultural perspective. So cultural psychology is kind of lumped in with the social psychology. There's an argument that you could make a separate field of psychology just for culture. Now, you're probably wondering, why would someone study psychology? Why would someone want to do it as a job? The most obvious job would be either being working in a clinic or being a professor. There's actually a lot of different professions you can do as a psychologist. This is just a fun pie graph. Everyone loves pie. Some of the different employments of what psychologists do. So the largest one is private practice. So that's your therapist, your psychoanalyst, that kind of thing. Another large one in light blue is the hospitals and clinics. So people will work in hospitals and clinics, and that's both in a therapeutic role as well as an experimental role. So trying to understand what's happening, what causes, what can they do to help prevent, what can they do to help treat, different aspects of psychology. The second largest one in that kind of goldish color would be colleges and universities. So obviously a lot of that is professors. That's also your lab technicians, your research associates, and that's where most of the research is conducted in psychology. And that's where I am right now. And then in your kind of orangey color, you've got elementary and secondary school. So those are psychologists that will go into schools. They can be counselors in the schools. They can also be running some experiments of kind of looking at, what are the different types of social interactions or the best teaching environments for the students to really learn, to thrive, to interact well with their classmates. You've also got the nice dark red is business and government. So again, a lot of people will go into government, and that's, again, usually research. That's also that IO psychology will go in, and they help businesses optimize their structure, optimize morale, that kind of thing. And then we've got green for other. So there's a lot of other things that psychologists can do. Psychologists or research in psychology can really help pretty much anyone, everyone. So that's just kind of a catch-all, just in case we missed anything. You can see that it's actually a pretty large pie slice. So if we look at splitting a pie again, but looking at kind of which, I'm going to move that over, which field of psychology did they study in? So these are mostly people in a professional setting, or people that were in counseling type of thing. So if they go into counseling, go into clinical, what field did they study? And you can see that it's mostly made up of clinical industrial organization, people studying education or schooling, and then counseling. So if you're really more of a neuroscience type of person, you're probably not going to go into clinical. If you're more of a behavioral, cognitive person, again, might not go into clinical. You're probably more likely to go into research, or work with the government, or work at a university, that kind of thing. So that's all I've got for today. I know that was a bit of a longer video, but I really wanted to just cover it all in one go. So I hope you guys have a great long weekend. I will see you next week. And as always, send me an email if you have any